Prostitution is a very taboo topic that leaves an uncomfortable feeling in many of us. It doesn't often come up at the dinner table, but why is that? It shouldn't be. It's one of the oldest industries to exist, but many feel distrustful and disgusted by the industry itself, despite it existing all around us. According to Britannica's historical timeline of prostitution, last updated August 28th of 2013, sex work is an industry that has existed and thrived for centuries. Many strategies have been employed internationally to approach regulating the industry. However, often prostitutes are victimized and abused, whereas buyers and third parties are given power. This dangerous narrative has left an open space for human trafficking to flourish and cycles of abuse to exist. Today I'm going to start with the story of a sex worker named Kara. In the This American Life episode called There, I Fixed It, posted July 2nd, 2021, Kara recalls her own experiences within the industry. At 18 years old, Kara began working as a stripper. Not long after, she was recruited by a friend to escort in New York. Naively, Kara believed what she was told by friends and the recruiter, that escorting was simply going on dates. Kara met up with a man named Larry who continued the narrative that Kara would be going on dates that Larry organized. However, that date on her first date, Kara was assaulted. Kara felt embarrassed and ashamed. She realized then what escorting was and that she now belonged to a pimp. The pimp and his gang abused Kara and controlled her whole life for the next 8 years. Kara had no money and no way to reach out to any family. She was threatened and told she would be further abused if she did try to seek out help. When Kara was approached by police, it was only to receive more citations and arrests for solicitation, and she was told that this is what she got for being a prostitute. So now that we can see a little bit about what it looks like within the states and how people end up in prostitution, let's discuss why it's such a long debated topic and the different approaches that have been employed. Today, I will give a brief history of prostitution, explain the current problems with the industry and different approaches to resolving the industry's issues, and a few appropriate action steps for communities to take. The first thing we will discuss is the history of prostitution and the problems within the United States' current approach to prostitution. So, the history of prostitution dates back to ancient times. Referring again to Britannica's article on the historical timeline of prostitution, published in August of 2013, in 2400 BC, the first record of a female prostitute was ever documented. A century later, Hammurabi's code documents the rights of prostitutes. As we can see, the industry has existed and thrived for thousands of years. Briefly, in the United States, prostitution was legal. In 1870, St. Louis even passed the Social Evil Ordinance Act, which was a step towards regulating prostitution. In 1910, however, the Mann Act was passed, which was a federal law prohibiting prostitution. States shortly followed this law and began to make prostitution illegal. Prohibiting prostitution, or making it illegal, involves criminalizing all parties involved, the seller, the buyer, and anyone else. Nevada is the only state where prostitution is legalized and regulated to this day. The brief history of prostitution within the United States is littered with problems. The first being the bad stigma associated with prostitutes. Many consider sex work a debate of morality. Considering sex workers as immoral has perpetuated the image that prostitutes are perpetuators of crime rather than results of crime, aka they are responsible for their negative lifestyle rather than victims of negative situations. Another issue is that prostitution is deeply intertwined with human trafficking. Human trafficking, according to the United States Department of Justice currently published definition, is a crime that involves exploiting a person for labor, services, or commercial sex. Those that are trafficked are trapped in cycles of abuse where they have little to no power or control over their lives. Violence against sex workers is another very critical issue. Violence is perpetuated by Johns or pimps. In a study conducted on sex workers in Miami by the U.S. National Library of Medicine, published in 2012, found that 34% of street-based sex workers had experienced violence in the last 90 days. Sex workers, who are often victims of abuse, cannot safely report crimes without risk of arrest or retribution in the form of fines. Within most of the United States, as stated previously, sex work is illegal. The result of this is that clients and third parties now have a certain power over prostitutes. They are free to treat them as they like and as poorly as they like, because they know that the prostitute won't report the crime. Also, prostitution is linked to the rise of sexually transmitted diseases. According to IQ Solutions article, Sex Workers and STIs, the Ignored Epidemic, published April 19, 2016, the rates of STIs are 5 to 60 times higher among sex workers than in general populations. Sex work is a cyclical industry that keeps people from being able to get out of it, whether it's their health or their criminal record. So, remembering Kara's experience with the sex industry, we can see the problems. Kara was abused, a victim of trafficking, and criminalized. 8 years later, Kara was controlled by the gang. One night at a motel, Kara was so badly beat that a guest called the police. Her pimp was arrested for domestic violence, which gave Kara the time to run away. She would attempt to find employment outside of sex work, but was rejected to most jobs due to failed background checks. Soon, Kara would return to sex work as it became the only sustainable option. Now that you have some knowledge of the problem, there are a few approaches that have been taken internationally to resolve it. The most obvious solution would be to legalize and put regulations into place. Each state would be required to regulate the industry. Sex work would take place in brothels in legally zoned areas. Licenses for businesses that follow OSHA standards would be required, and they would be subject to health department visits. Sex workers would be required to be registered like other employees of businesses. Regular monthly health checkups for the sex workers would be required, and that would involve a check for STDs. If anything were to arise in their health checkup, they would be suspended from work and offered other employment within the brothel. There would be age restrictions. I would argue the age of 21. The additional 3 years between 18 and 21 provides time to find other employment options for recent high school graduates or students. Brothels then would also be required to follow these guidelines just like every other business. If they refused, they'd be shut down. Sex workers in this situation would have a level of protection from sickness and security within the brothel. Lastly, I will discuss my stance and some action steps for the community. I believe that sex work should be legalized for a few key reasons. The existence of sex work has existed for centuries. Whether or not current culture considers sex work moral doesn't deter its existence. It isn't going anywhere. There are many trafficking victims and victims of abuse within the sex work industry. The best way to protect these victims is to create access to legal support and health care. Many are stuck in this line of work because of a criminal background. It seems that making sex work illegal keeps prostitutes in the industry longer and away from other opportunities. Now, there are a couple exceptional benefits to legalizing sex work beyond that. Sex workers don't have to worry about their criminal background. When they aren't criminalized for their sex work, they don't have that record, so they're able to find new work, and they won't end up like Kara. They are able to safely report crimes related to their job. Currently, if that were to occur, they are at risk of criminalization. From the perspective of Juno Mack, as a current sex worker, if the sex worker has a safe space to report crimes, it lowers their risk of vulnerability. Some action steps our community can take in support are to contact their state representatives to encourage them to decriminalize and legalize sex work, to donate and subscribe to the NCLU, as they do have a similar stance, and to discuss work in a way that doesn't stigmatize the seller. Today I explained to you the history and the problems within the management of prostitution and why Legalizing prostitution is a logical option. Prostitution has been a long-established and heavily debated industry. The current reality is that the industry is filled with problems and in need of a different approach. Prostitution and sex workers themselves have long been thought of as a dark, separate side of society. The reality is, it's all around us, more than we'd like to think. It's an employment that many have turned to as a result of trafficking or lack of options. The ambition to make these workers seem like their negative lifestyle as a result of their own intent has created space for dangerous and violent abuse. I would like to close with some questions for the crowd. First, do you believe that legalization is the best approach? Second, do you believe that the hard sex work legislation should be about protecting the sex worker? And lastly, if you were to have a family member engaged in sex work, what kind of protections would you want put in place? And that is